Okay, let's everybody welcome. It's already 7:02, so we'll get started. And hopefully more people will trickle in as we get started. So just to introduce myself, I'm Kathy Jones, and I'm from Birds Canada, and I am the MC for tonight's event. And we have two great speakers. And to begin, I wanted to give a bit of an acknowledgement that I am personally at home, which is on the northeast shore of Long Point on Lake Erie. And this location is on the lands and traditional lands and unceded territories of the Haudenosaunee, Adirondack, Anishinaabe, and Mississauga peoples. And I am also within the area of the 1792 Treaty 3, which is sometimes called the Between the Lakes Treaty. The panelists and the guests of this meeting come from many areas right around Turtle Island. And I welcome you to take a look at the link that I will drop into the chat and see what traditional territories and lands that you are on as well. Oh, it's already done. Thank you, Kaylin. Now, one particular treaty resonates personally with me quite strongly, and that's the one dish, one spoon wampum. Which again covers much of the areas of this talk. And the wampum tree is between the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas, and the Anishinaabe peoples. And it relates to the shared traditional hunting grounds that they have. And there's three teachings that I still think relate to today. And that is we should only take what we need, keep the environment clean, and leave some for the future. And I think they very much still apply. So, welcome, as I said, to the Sappy Hour. For those of you who have not been here before, the word Sappy Hour, it's a play on Happy Hour combined with the Atlas mascot, which is the Sap Sucker, the Sap Sucker. And this is an opportunity to relax and learn about the Atlas from presentations about different topics related to the Atlas. And it's also a chance for participants to get to know more about the project and to ask the Atlas team questions. Now, we've had a real great treat this year. This is the third of a series of 3 Sappy Hours on how the data can and will be used. And if you've missed the first two, they're available on the Atlas YouTube page. And so take the time to look at those after the fact. Now, we are on Zoom, and I believe we are being recorded, and it will also be streamed on Facebook Live. We are hoping this to be very interactive. So share your questions, use the Q&A that's available to share your questions. If you're using Facebook Live, just put in the comments and somebody will pull it over to the Q&A for us to see. We'll keep the Zoom chat for technical stuff. And so I will introduce the presenters and we'll let them present. And then after both are done, we will open it up for questions. And two presenters will be Johnny Nene and Mercy Harris, with Jonathan starting first. So let me introduce you to Jonathan. So Jonathan comes to us from the Natural Resources Solution Incorporated, where he's a biologist that specializes in aquatic and avian ecology. Prior to that, he was a species and risk migratory bird technician at the Norris Lab at the University of Guelph, where he assisted on a wood thrush field study, or many field studies by the looks of it. Johnny is an avid outdoors person who enjoys birding and fishing, and most recently, work-related, he's been doing raptor surveys, winter raptor surveys, and recreational birding in Amherst Island. Although I think he was doing raptor surveys closer to home this week and got a really good talk this week. Johnny's presentation will focus on Atlas data, applications, and the applications of that data for environmental consulting. So, Johnny, if you're ready, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you guys for having me here. And I'm going to share my screen now and make sure everything's all good to go. Okay. Okay, you guys see the presentation okay?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Okay, again, so thanks for having me. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about how we utilize the breeding bird atlas data in the environmental consulting sector. So at the very least, I hope you find it a little bit interesting. So let's get into it. Okay, so just a general overview here. So I'll talk a little bit about my background, and then I'll talk a little bit as well about who NRSI is as a company. Then we'll talk about our involvement with the Bird Atlas, how we utilize Bird Atlas data to protect birds, and then I'll get into some project-related examples, and then we can touch on, why the data is important, what's important for atlasers, and how you guys can have the best influence on protecting birds. Okay, so I grew up in Hespeler Village, which is in Cambridge, Ontario. I spent a lot of time just kind of exploring, the woods behind my house and just generally being outside, doing some fishing on the Speed River. And that kind of is what pushed me to then, get an education in the environmental field. So I went to fishing, I went to Fleming College in Lindsay and took the Fish and Wildlife program there. And that's really where I started to learn a lot more about birds and became interested in birds. So after graduating, I started my career as a fish and wildlife policy intern with Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. From there, I then worked as a species at risk migratory bird technician for University of Guelph, and then just kind of transitioned out of that role to a more permanent role here at Natural Resource Solutions, where my main focuses are avian and aquatic surveying. Okay, so who is NRSI? So the short of it is that we are biologists. So we got a diverse team with aquatic, terrestrial, and wetland biologists. And then we also have a team of GIS analysts. And of course, our administrative staff that keep us going. So we are proudly Indigenous owned, CCAB certified. So that's kind of a new thing for us. And we have 2 offices, one of which is in Waterloo, Ontario, where I work out of, and another in Calgary, Alberta. And we offer a pretty broad spectrum of environmental services, so species at risk screenings, environmental assessments, environmental impact studies, post-construction monitoring, various fish and wildlife relocations and restoration projects. And we're involved in quite a few different sectors as well. So development, energy, some wind, solar, a little bit of dam stuff in there as well. Infrastructure, bridges, roads, that sort of thing. A bit of resources too, so some mining and forestry related work, and of course natural heritage systems. And the big thing for NRSI is we want to ensure that everything we do is science-based. We want it to be defensible and repeatable, and this is kind of the main focus that we take when we approach all of our projects and all of our surveys. Okay, so how are we involved with the Breeding Bird Atlas? So we've utilized Bird Atlas data for a very long time on our projects. I mean, we use it pretty much daily because it's so important and we recognize how important it is. And we also utilize the methodologies in the Bird Atlas and so the survey protocols and things like that. We utilize them slightly modified when we need to. And that just helps us maintain, high standards. And we, of course, want to ensure that the Bird Atlas continues to get the support that it needs, which is why in the past we've donated funds or contract hires to the Atlas. So in 2021, it was tough with a lot of cuts to jobs, especially with the government. So supplying some birders that year for the Atlas was important. And even in the more recent years, we continue to supply dedicated birders to the Atlas. So we like to offer various supports for them, so vehicles, accommodations, and different surveying equipment. So those are kind of the main involvements we have. So how do we utilize the data to protect birds? So one thing that we do is we utilize the survey protocols, as I touched on previously, and we use it to develop our own protocols. We take the Atlas protocols and we use it as a foundation, and sometimes we make minor tweaks because projects can get so specific. But why is that important? Well, it ensures that we're using industry-leading methods, right? So that's going to lend credibility to the work that we do, especially when in some instances projects may end up in court, right? So you want to make sure that you're utilizing widely accepted industry-leading methods. So we also pretty regularly, most projects will actually pull the highest level of breeding evidence in the background review process. So that's very early on in the project. We need to know high level what's in the area. So you can see this atlas square here. So, you know, you may have a project like a subject property that's somewhere within that atlas square. So we would then pull the highest level of breeding evidence documented from within that atlas square, and we use that in creating our species list. And, you know, so why is that important? Well, it's really important because, you know, any documented species at risk within that atlas square are going to come up, and that's going to let us know, okay, we need to give special consideration right out of the gate because we know that they've been seen here. So we need to pay especially close attention to the habitats of these birds as it relates to our subject property, and not just species at risk, but other sensitive species in general. And then we also like to plug the Atlas quiz. I like this personally. I try and plug it amongst our staff, you know, contract staff, but also permanent staff. It just ensures that we're being consistent because there's some tricky ones on that quiz. So it's a good refresher going into the breeding bird season and just in general. So that's another way that we like to utilize the Atlas data there. Okay, so let's get into some more specific examples. So here we have, you know, an example of what could be one of our project subject properties. So it's a golf course, as you can see. There are some natural features. We have some wooded areas within and that sort of thing. So, you know, potentially, let's say there's some proposed development for this, this golf course. So we need to ensure that there's going to be no detriment to any natural heritage features. So we need to know what's there. So that's going to lead us to, you know, have to start doing an environmental impact study. Okay, so, you know, as I mentioned previously, one of the first things we do is we're going to pull the highest level of breeding evidence from within that Atlas square. And, you know, we can see that there's eastern screech owl was reported. Now, it's not very common, but we have had some instances where owl surveys are requested either by the county or, you know, some other governing authority. So the surveys have been requested. We see in the background data that eastern screech owl is known to occur within this Atlas square. So as I mentioned previously, sometimes we have to modify the survey protocols to meet our needs. So under the standard OBBA Eastern Screech Owl survey protocol, that would mean 10 roadside point count stations. And they have to be adjacent to suitable habitat, but they also must be at least 1 kilometer apart and not in front of a residence. So as you can see, we do have a road up here, and we do have a road here, but it doesn't really give us great coverage for some of the areas that are key within the subject property. It's not going to allow us to get some good surveying done over here or some of these other, you know, woodlots or wooded areas. So we need to modify it a little bit to meet our needs. So then it may end up looking something like this. So these would be point count stations, and, you know, although the protocol says 1 kilometer apart, again, that's not really going to give us great coverage, but we also don't want to be getting too close together. So, you know, for these ones, we've utilized the standard point count protocol of a minimum 250 meters away. And I think this gives good coverage for the site. It allows us to target some of the key areas that may be containing eastern screech owl, while still following, the other guidelines in the OBVA protocol for weather and that sort of thing. Okay, another example, you may have a project where a client, has this property and they want to take this lot here and they want to do a severance of the lot. Maybe they want to put a residential, a house here on the property. So we're going to have to make sure that there's no negative impacts to natural heritage features. So again, we need to know what's there before we can even say that. So that's going to mean background data gathering, and it's going to mean surveys. So this is kind of what a typical species list might look like for us. So you're going to have your species named here. I realize that's kind of tough to see, but I'll try and walk you guys through it. You're going to have some of the species at risk designations. And then here we have a column for breeding bird atlas and the highest level of breeding evidence. So again, that's crucial for pretty much all the background bird lists that we do. And then we're going to pay special attention to any species at risk. Okay, and any species at risk that come up in our background screening, we're then going to look at their habitat descriptions and compare that to the habitats within the subject property using aerial imagery and determine, is there any suitable habitat for these species based on what we're seeing? Okay, so for example, let's say with the background information, we've got 101 species with breeding evidence. Okay, for those of you who don't know, NHIC is the Natural Heritage Information Center. So they have, documented species at risk within, it's similar to Atlas squares. I'm not sure if they're exactly, but there is some overlap there. So NHIC is showing we've got 2 species at risk birds within that square, bobolink and eastern meadowlark. Now the bird atlas highest breeding evidence list is showing that we have 8 SAR or SCC species within the study area. And then based on their habitat descriptions and our assessment of the habitats within the subject property, we've determined that we've got 6 that might have some possible suitable habitat, and 2 that certainly, yes, it looks like there is definitely confirmed suitable habitat based on our aerial imagery interpretation. So where do we go from there? We go out and we conduct our breeding bird surveys. And then the results of those surveys are going to maybe give you something like this. So we've observed 5 SAR or SCC birds across our surveys. 2 species were just observed, so probably picked up on one survey, but not any subsequent surveys. Then we've got 1 with possible breeding evidence, another with probable breeding evidence, and then we also have confirmed breeding evidence for cerulean warbler. So where does that mean then? So cerulean warbler, they're afforded protections under the Endangered Species Act. So within that subject property, we're going to have to make sure that the proper protections or mitigative measures are in place going forward. Okay, so talking a little bit about what you guys can do as atlasers to have the greatest effect of protecting birds. I know I've seen it plugged in some of the Atlas emails from coordinators that coverage for squares with less coverage is important. So that's definitely something, that I would look to prioritize. And then from my perspective as a consultant, the most protections are going to be given to species at risk birds. So if you can find confirmed breeding evidence for any SAR or SCC birds, that's going to be huge. And that's even something that you can then inform the Natural Heritage Information Center so that they have those observations documented as well on another database. And then, just generally improving. Everybody has room for improvement, so keep brushing up on your audio and visual ID. If you do find nests, you can take some time to see if you can observe the species coming back to the nest. And if not, that you can always take photos take some measurements, and do your best to identify the species. Okay, so that's pretty much it for me. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you found that, at least somewhat interesting and just got a bit of a glimpse of how we utilize the data in the consulting realm.
That was great, Jonathan. Especially how you tied it all the way back to the atlas at the end and how people can help through the atlas to make more useful and productive data. Mercy, I'm going to let you sign off. I need you to stop sharing screen and then Mercy can start sharing. And while she does that, I will introduce Mercy. Our next guest is Mercy Harris. Mercy is from Pennsylvania originally and moved to Canada to study environmental biology at McGill University. And during her time there is when Mercy developed her interest in birds. After that, she followed McGill with graduate studies in Saskatchewan on tree and barn swallows, which, from what I understand, she's still in Saskatchewan. But she now works with Birds Canada to identify and assess sites that are highly important for the persistence of biodiversity. Now, these sites in our world are called key biodiversity areas. Now, Mercy tells us that she enjoys her work on KBAs because she feels she learns something new about Canadian birds every day. Tonight, Mercy will share with us her talk, Good Squares and Godwits, how Ontario Atlas data support the identification of key biodiversity areas. Mercy, over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Kathy, for that introduction. Without further ado, I'll take it away and talk about how, in my work with Birds Canada, identifying key biodiversity areas in Ontario, I've used Atlas data, and again, how maybe this can spur you to some future work or motivate you to keep going. So I'll just start by talking about what a key biodiversity area is, and you'll hear me abbreviate that as KBA throughout the presentation tonight, and sort of what's happening with KBAs, how they relate to important bird areas, how Atlas data has been used in identification, some opportunities for more contributions in the future, and how you can keep up to date. So to start off on the very basic thing, what am I even here talking about? What are key biodiversity areas? Well, the story of key biodiversity areas in Canada really starts with the story of important bird areas, or IBAs. IBAs were developed in Canada about 20 to 25 years ago to recognize habitats and locations that are highly important for the persistence of birds in Canada. The IBA program has had a lot of success in identifying these habitats, but also encouraging and promoting the stewardship and conservation of these areas. From the IBA program, there's been other systems that have been similarly developed. For example, Plant Life International has developed important plant areas. There are Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, there are important butterfly areas, etc. So there are a lot of different designation systems for different types of taxa to represent these key habitats that are important for them. But because there are different systems, that can also mean that maybe it's a little bit more complicated to identify these hotspots for biodiversity than it could be. So this has led to the question about whether there's a way to put these locations that are important for all these different types of biodiversity under a single designation system. That's where key biodiversity areas come in. Key biodiversity areas can be broadly defined as sites that are important for the persistence of global biodiversity. And the idea was developed in the mid-2010s when international conservation partners from across the globe decided that there was benefit in developing globally standardized criteria to recognize habitats that are important for different types of taxa and pull it all into one system. Like important bird areas, KBAs are not meant to prescribe management or automatically confer protections on an area, but are instead meant to be more of an information tool that hopefully governments or decision makers can use to both identify sensitive areas that should be prioritized for conservation and, areas that maybe should be avoided in terms of development, disruption, etc. So with the KBA program, It's standardized globally so that people in Madagascar or Finland or Canada are all using the same type of criteria to identify these places that are important for biodiversity. In Canada, the initiative to identify KBAs is being done by a couple different partner NGOs. So me and my team at Birds Canada, we are starting with the basis of important bird areas and say, okay, we know these places are highly important for birds. Let's see if these places are, first of all, still 20 to 25 years later, highly important for birds. And if so, do they meet the criteria necessary to become or be designated as key biodiversity areas? So we're focusing on that from the bird perspective. Our partners at WCS Canada, with support from NatureServe Canada, are working to identify new KBAs for non-bird species. Like I said earlier, this will be anything from insects to lichens to plants to fish to you name it. So with that in mind of, what key biodiversity areas are all about, we can look at this map of existing important bird areas and say, holy moly, this is a lot of work to do. This is almost 600 existing IBAs that Birds Canada is working on re-updating, reassessing, and getting more information for. And in Ontario, that's about 65 IBAs. So Atlas data can be used in KBA identification because, as you can probably imagine, this is a very data-intensive process to reassess all these different sites and see whether they meet KBA criteria. In terms of criteria and sort of what sorts of data I'm working with on a daily basis, for better or worse, the KBA program is very focused on species and it's very focused on the number of individuals in a given place. The idea is that if a habitat has a significant number of individuals of a given species, then the loss of that habitat or the degradation of that site would be a potential blow to that species. So if it's a species that has a high continental population, it's going to have a much higher number of individuals that need to be met. If it's a species that's listed by CIWIC as threatened or endangered, it's going to have a lower number of individuals that need to be met in recognition of the fact that the smaller the population or the more at risk a species is, the more important every single habitat becomes for that species. Not only do we need to demonstrate there's a certain number of individuals of a species in a given site, we also have to demonstrate that that species has been present in those large numbers recently. So we have a lot of sites where we might have great data from surveys done in the 80s or the 90s, and then we have nothing. So we really need to be able to demonstrate that recently in the last 10 or 12 years that that species has been present. And we also need to demonstrate that the species is regularly present. So we need to have at least 2 years of data demonstrating that the species is present. So that way we're not designating sites as KBAs for one-off influxes or, unusual years. So we really need a lot of data to demonstrate recent presence, regular presence, etc. And as you can imagine, that our biggest constraint is therefore lack of data. And this is where Atlas data can come in because it can supply data that really complements other sources. We have access to many sources, a big one of which is eBird. But as you know, eBird doesn't do everything. Birders go to certain locations and don't go to other locations. eBird data is not only, has those gaps, but it's also harder for us to use to get a holistic idea of how many birds are at a site. So for example, on eBird, you might have one pair of cerulean warblers seen here on Monday, and another pair recorded over here in this different part of the site on Wednesday. And it's really not something you can combine to get an idea of how many pairs there might be in an area. So that's where Atlas data is being more standardized and more comprehensive than eBird comes in. As an example of how eBird data, or rather Atlas data, has been used so far, we can look at Southern Ontario and we can zoom in to the Skunks Misery Complex IBA, which is about 50-ish kilometers southwest of London. This is an area that has several woodlots that support Carolinian species like Prothonotary warblers, cerulean warblers, and Atlas data was present for this area and was useful in having us demonstrate that there's a reliable presence of multiple pairs of Prothonotary warbler in this area, and that was used to support our nomination for this site as a KBA. If we want to look at the whole other end of the province, we can go up north and we can look up the many sites that we have along Hudson Bay and zoom in at this one in particular. This is the Winnisk River Estuary KBA that, I was looking at this trying to assess this site, and it's a little bit tough when you're that far north. The data is really hard to come by. But we had previous records of Hudsonian godwits being present in sort of the muskeg, coastal areas along these lowland habitats. Fortunately, there were some atlas squares in this area that had been recently visited, and I was able to look at that data, reach out to the atlaser, and ultimately use the atlas data to support the nomination for this site. Honestly, without atlas data, we wouldn't have had any data more recent than 25-ish years ago, and there's no way that could have been used to support this becoming a KBA. So really important. In terms of contributions that could potentially continue, as I just said, there's really limited data for northern IBAs, and I recognize that there's a lot of difficult logistics involved with getting atlasers up north, but that's really a big data gap for us. If you look at this map, there's a ton of sites along James Bay and Hudson Bay, and there's 7 of these that you see listed on the left that currently have a lot of limitations in terms of data and aren't, as of now at least, going to be able to be nominated as KBAs. And these are sites that, historically we know are important for godwits and scoters and shorebirds, but they're just so remote that it's a big challenge. Another opportunity a little closer to home that might be a little bit more accessible is just sort of like Johnny said, targeting sites that don't have a lot of coverage, squares that haven't been covered well, because sometimes sites have limited access, or even they might have access, but they have elusive species that are hard to detect. So for example, if we want to look here in central Ontario, there's Luther Marsh. We know this is a stronghold for least bitterns in Ontario, but they're a highly secretive species. And as a result, we have really limited data for the site, apart from, one eBird sighting here, one eBird sighting there. So whether it's within the purview of the atlas or, anyone's keen to, get in a canoe at dawn and go out and do some surveys, this is the type of site with elusive species that could benefit from more data. Speaking of sites that are hard to access, we can look at Georgian Bay. We have a couple sites in Georgian Bay where they were designated as IBAs for nesting Caspian terns, but they are islands and they are hard to get to. So again, whether or not it's within the scope of Atlas or just encouraging people to get out and if you know the right people, talk to the right people and see if there's any way that we can get more data for IBAs like this. Lastly, even if you're not able to provide data, I would encourage you, if during this presentation you've been thinking, oh, yeah, I know about that IBA, or oh, I go to this place all the time. General comments about sites are always welcome, whether it's ongoing conservation actions or threats to sites, whether it's changes in that habitat or changes in species presence at that site, or even if it's just, hey Mercy, have you talked to so-and-so? They would probably be able to help you. That sort of information is also helpful for us because we need to get an idea of what's happening at the sites. So lastly, yes, the Godwit says it right. We want to hear from you. So lastly, if you want to keep up to date with our effort, you can visit kbacanada.org and explore around. You can find more detail about criteria and what we're doing there, including this map, which shows the sites that are being investigated as KBAs. Here, the green sites are ones that have already been designated. Orange sites are being investigated as KBAs for both birds and non-birds. But check back frequently. We're just about to update this map with more data in the coming week or two, and every week we're going through and adding more sites. So I know there's a lot of orange now, but we are quickly adding sites, and I encourage you to take a look, see what's near to you and what you might be able to help out with. So if you have anything that you'd be interested in contributing, you want to learn more, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is right there, or you can reach out to my supervisor, Amanda, and I'll of course be happy to answer any questions that come up during the rest of tonight. So with that, I will turn it back over to Kathy.
Thank you, Mercy. That was a great presentation and so informative. We don't have a lot of questions yet. I asked people to put the questions out, or else I'm going to ask a bunch. So if you want your thoughts heard, please add the questions. We have one question for sure, and that's from Kai Milliard, and that's, can I help? Now, I'm assuming that relates to the KBA work. By the sounds of it, one great way they can help, Mercy, would be doing point counts and checklist counts in places we don't presently have atlasing completed.
Yeah, I would say anything that gets data in places either where Atlas doesn't have data already, or yeah, just a generally undersurveyed, underbirded area would be great. Like I said, there's IBAs that, you know, just aren't as accessible or are a little bit less frequently birded. That would be, yeah, point counts or surveys in those areas would be great. One thing I will add is if you are ever doing surveys within multiple, you know, you get a group of people to go out, do multiple locations within a single IBA, there's a special feature on eBird where you can mark your checklist on that very first page where it's like stationary traveling, etc. You can mark it as the IBA protocol, and that's just a way to designate that your list was done in different locations, but all within the same IBA, all on the same day. And that's a great way for us to know that your data is a little bit above and beyond the average eBird checklist.
And remember, when you're atlasing, you can share your atlas data with the eBird as well. Johnny, please, you're welcome to join us. I don't have a lot of questions right now for Johnny. I have a couple more for Mercy, but I have one. This kind of Johnny and Mike related. The OpenBA data will be pushed into NHC, won't it, Mike, and then be more useful to the consultants in the future?
Yeah, excuse me. Yes. Oh, and my fan's on my computer, so I don't know if you can hear me. But yes, absolutely. The NHIC scoops up data from lots of different places, including the Atlas. So yeah, you don't have to do two different things. It's nice where all these different systems generally talk pretty nicely to each other. So just get it in the Atlas, and we'll do the rest.
While we're promoting KBAs, are any of the northern routes to those gap areas that Mercy has?
Yeah, I was thinking that. Yeah, we've got quite a few planned trips to a bunch of those proposed KBAs. So should be able to fill in a bunch of gaps this summer.
Terrific. Now the next question is from Robert. I'm a volunteer manager with the current IBA. How would I find out status regarding KBAs? Mercy?
Yeah, so I would say first step, go to kbacanada.org. You can look at the map and see, first of all, whether it's already been approved. So we have, you know, the heavy hitters have already been approved as KBAs, like Long Point. Otherwise, I would say that if you want specifics on where it is in the process, shoot me an email and I will be more than happy to fill you in or hear any comments or input that you have. And I can pop my email in the chat.
Cool. That'd be very helpful for people. And certainly make sure we have the links. Oh, Kaylin already put the KBA link in. She's always ahead of me. Next question is from Hannah, and she's wondering if there's any legal protection for KBAs in Ontario or Canada.
Designation or identification alone doesn't confer protections, but what I will say is that there has been interest and uptake from governments on using KBAs to guide priority areas for conservation. So for example, like the 30 by 30 initiative, there's been interest in using KBAs as, you know, priority sites. So in and of itself, no, it's just meant to be an information tool. But our hope is, of course, that by recognizing these sites as being important, we can promote stewardship and ultimately, hopefully, protection of them.
Very interesting. Another kind of related question. I noticed that you had Luther Marsh, which is a conservation authority area. Mike, will we be able to get into, will we have permits for conservation areas this year for OBBA people?
It really is a case by case basis. So I'm not sure if we have one. That's GRCA, I think. I don't know. Got for GRCA, to be perfectly honest. Kaylin, I don't know. Do you know the latest on that one?
Yeah, I think the regional coordinator for the Guelph area, they might have had a field trip planned for Luther Marsh, and we're trying to work out the permitting for that. And I know they were also discussing the possibility of doing some ARU stuff instead. And so, yeah, that is something that has been discussed and is kind of in the works.
Speaking of ARUs, Johnny, does your organization use ARU data much? Can't hear you. Well, Johnny is doing that. I just like to mention people, we have time for more questions, so please go ahead and add them.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
I just unplugged it and plugged it back in. I don't know. Did you say AOU data?
ARU, automated record, am I getting this right? Automated recording devices?
I mean, I'm not familiar of us using that in recent times, but maybe they have previously. Uh, if we do, I wouldn't know about it. I'll say that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. We see. We have a couple questions here on the chat. So I'm going to try to read some of those. Somebody says it's a great excuse to go to Polar Bear and Tidewater. Hey, yeah, if you want to take the train to north and do some canoeing along the James Bay, go for it, people. Nina says great info. I had no idea how useful the Atlas info was to you folk. It's very helpful. We all are quite delighted to see this data being built. And if you didn't watch the last 2 YouTube videos, make sure you do. They're great. Okay, Donald Sutherland has a question. To what extent will the recently announced James Hudson Bay National Conservation Reserve overlap with the existing KBAs on these coasts?
I don't know a ton about the announcement of the reserve. I had heard of it. I don't know specifics. In general, we along the coasts aren't super focusing on marine areas. We're focusing more on the shoreline, so there will be some overlap. Again, because KBAs don't confer automatic protections, it is probably just going to be overlap to the extent of, okay, we do have this reserve, we do have this protected area along the coast, along the inshore marine areas, and then we have this, specific information layer that these are hot spots in these specific sections of coast. So I can't speak too specifically to that, but we are aware of that and are working in coordination with some local partners, local Indigenous groups to make sure that we're all collaborating as much as possible.
Good to know. And I think my recollection working with a lot of the marine and parks organizations is they will reach out to the different groups as if they would like data. Remember as well that the Atlas data does go into nature counts and is available for any consultant or land manager or stakeholder who needs that information. And that just empowers it so much more. A couple more questions. Jeremy St. Ange are wondering if the MNRF bird monitoring locations are synced to Atlas data during the breeding bird atlases. Mike, would you be able to approach that one?
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of different MNRF, that's the Provincial Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. There's a lot of different monitoring type programs that happens through them. Definitely some of that data is coming to us, but I mean, I can't speak to every single bird monitoring program that exists, but some of the bigger ones that use those autonomous recording units and sort of long-term monitoring plots, those things we are getting the data flowing into the Atlas, which is great.
Now, I have a question for Johnny, who has not had a lot of questions, and my apologies for putting you on the hot spot here, but you might have told us. I also apologize for not listening well enough. the data you guys collect, are you able through work to put it back into the atlas afterwards if it's work collected data, or is that usually controlled by privacy rights of the landowner?
Yeah, so kind of what you said is how unfortunately it is sometimes. So that data is, you know, if we're on a client's property, then technically they're the owner of that data. So it would be protected. However, there are some instances, maybe I shouldn't say this, but there are some instances where you know, it's been uploaded for like very unique observations, and that would have required permission from, you know, the project managers or the client, right? So, but it does happen sometimes for unique observations.
That's cool to know. One more question, I think. This is from John Black, and I think it's perhaps for everyone. And it's is there currently any use of the atlas data in the observed category? Now, observed, would that be just presence absence? Yeah.
Yeah, observed is like when there's no breeding evidence attached to it.
So
Yeah, so for everybody who's familiar with Atlas codes, I think what John's asking about are the X's, or if it doesn't have breeding evidence. So if it's missing the breeding evidence code, we can go back and retroactively add it in some cases if it's, you know, within a safe date in a place we know, like within the known breeding range of that species. We might just go in and add it ourselves, and by we I mean the Atlas. So sometimes those can be used by converting them from an observed to like the possible breeding evidence category. But those X's, there's certainly the possibility for them to be used. We're not using them for any of the Atlas data analyses in terms of, you know, modeling habitat or modeling abundance or anything like that, because they represent the whole point of that category is the species is observed there, but it's not showing any breeding evidence. So it could just be, in most cases, it's just a migrant passing through or a non-breeding individual of that species. But that's just when we're talking about the atlas. And, you know, if you're talking about, I'm sorry, Mercy, I'm stepping on your toes on this one, but if you're talking about, you know, is there big concentrations of non-breeding individuals of a species at a site, then that could absolutely have applications beyond the atlas.
Which brings to me another question. If they, for example, are doing a point count and the best breeding evidence then get observed, because it's a point count, it has a time and frame and an effort frame involved with it. Is that more useful data for consultant or for the KBA program? If it in that situation?
Maybe I'll just add to how we would look at that. So that highest level breeding evidence list that we use in our background information gathering process, if we're getting stuff from the atlas and that's the highest code, we're still gonna consider that it was observed there, and it would still get consideration when we go to carry out surveys. Now, I don't necessarily know that you're gonna have, you know, for example, a bird that breeds up in the tundra. I don't necessarily know that if you get an observed code that it's going to be in that list, you know, because you guys are going to vet all that on your end with the atlas before it gets put onto those lists that's accessed through the website. So I don't know if you'd see something like that, but if we did, let's say, see, you know, something weird like snowy owl, we would be pretty confident ruling out, you know, breeding habitat prior to going to the site during the regular breeding season. But again, we still consider it, all the species on the list.
Mercy, do you feel the same, or do you have anything to add?
No, I don't think anything particularly that Mike or Johnny didn't hit on. I would just say, yeah, like there's use for data about concentrations of non-breeders as well. I didn't specifically say this, but KBAs can be designated not only for breeding birds, but for sites that are important for stopover or even for non-breeding for some species. So we'll take it all. We'll take all the data you have.
Speaking of data, this is from Kate Ballantyne, and she's wondering, she's familiar with the old IBA data set, and she's wondering if it's going to be continued to be updated and maintained, or will the focus go towards the KBA data set? That'll be for you, Mercy.
The focus is definitely shifting toward KBAs. For a couple reasons. First of all, because it's sort of being recognized as the new global standard for identifying biodiversity hotspots. And secondly, because any sites that don't meet criteria to become KBAs, it then becomes the question of, okay, what do we do with these? In many cases, they haven't been, reassessed. Are we going to go through and keep the existing IBA criteria and still apply those? The answer is maybe, but really the focus is definitely shifting toward KBAs. That's not to say we're gonna, delete everything that isn't a KBA or doesn't relate to KBAs, but that's definitely where at least in Canada, the conservation community's focus is trending.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very good information. And we put the website out. Maybe we can share it later in something as well. Looks like we have answered everyone's questions. If you still have questions, we have time, but we'll start wrapping it up a little. If you have any questions later on, there's places you can email us. You can email Mercy. She's given us our email. You can put them on the website or the Discord server. So there's plenty of places you can ask your questions later. And I hope you found this as interesting as I have. Upcoming events I should mention. Remember, it's OWL survey time. And soon we'll be moving into the really organized OWL surveys and the Marsh surveys. And not long after that, it'll just be back to regular atlasing, which I think everybody's looking forward to. Also check those safe dates. I'm hearing a lot of calls right now, but that doesn't mean that those species are in the safe dates to survey. They might not be breeding yet. So check that out before you decide to put something down as showing evidence of breeding. As I mentioned a couple times, the YouTube channel has the last 2 talks as well as every other Sappy Hour. So that is a great one to do. And what else do we have? Any closing remarks from Johnny or from Mercy? Anything you want to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. So I know there was a question about whether or not KBAs or IBAs are afforded protections. So one thing that we also look at in a consulting realm is significant wildlife habitat. This is like another part of like our background screening. So basically any KBA or I should say some of the KBAs or IBAs have these, like Mercy said, will have such large congregations or like are important stopover areas. And things like that are often criteria within like the significant wildlife habitat, like reference document from the MNRF. So those things are given like protection consideration as significant wildlife habitat. So a lot of the times those KBAs and IBAs might, meet those criteria. So it might not say within the significant wildlife habitat guide, oh, if it's a KBA or IBA, it's protected. But the criteria is essentially what made it an IBA or KBA, and therefore it's getting protected for, a different definition, so to speak. So I just wanted to add that there.
Thank you. Again, supporting this idea that every checklist, every special survey, every point count is all important to help support conservation of birds in Ontario. Mercy, anything else?
Yeah, I popped this in the chat, but I'll quickly say that, sort of beyond this somewhat short-term effort to initially identify KBAs, there will be an ongoing reassessment process every 8 to 12 years is the goal to reassess KBAs and make sure we keep a little bit better up to date with what's happening in KBAs than maybe what has been with IBAs. But beyond that, we're also always looking for people who are interested in helping steward and advocate and caretake for these sites. So that's a little bit more the realm of my supervisor, Amanda. But I popped her email in the chat. So if you're interested in potentially becoming involved with caretaking, she'd be more than happy to answer any questions or tell you more about that.
Terrific. And we're getting close to the end of the hour. So thank you to both of you for coming. Thank you for Kaylin and Mike for putting this on. Do either you want to add anything before we sign off? I'm getting no.
No, just
Okay.
a big thank you to Mercy, Johnny, and you, Kathy. You
It's
know, obviously Mike and I can advocate for how cool and how important the Atlas is, but it's nice to hear from other folks that they think it's important too. So thank you guys for taking the time out of your night.
Thanks.
glad to do it.
Happy to be
Yeah.
there.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it's so cool how everything interreacts. And so I'm so glad that we managed to get you guys on the show to talk about it, this webinar. So I guess we can say goodnight and thank you all for attending, and you get another 4 minutes back to your life, and have a good weekend, because it's almost weekend, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good
Yeah,
night.
listen.
Night.
Bye.